Okay. All right. So welcome everyone. Again, my name is Graham Shuckman. I am one of the AWS student instructors. So if you're familiar with the STIX program, it allows undergraduate students to teach topics of interest. So I am teaching the AWS class in the business school for the second time now. This is my first time as a Technica workshop leader. So very excited, very honored to be here. I know Technica is incredibly important and impactful for underrepresentation in STEM. So please, by all means, feel free to come off mic or drop questions in the chat if you have any. I've led this workshop before, but not for, oh my goodness, 75 people. So we'll see how it goes. In the meantime, Lillian, thank you so much for kind of monitoring the chat and dropping the links in. Lillian just dropped the link to the PDF, which has some of the instructions for the co-requisites. Basically account creation. So to do this workshop, you're going to need an AWS account. You'll need a Python Reddit developer account, and just a few other kind of bells and whistles. Luckily, since this is being recorded, if you are not able to follow along completely, you can always kind of go back and do it later. With that being said, it is a bit of a longer workshop, and I'd like to have time to answer any questions through the code. Lillian, if you can just keep maybe dropping that link in the chat again, I'd appreciate it. And then let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share out my screen here, and we'll get going. All right, so let's start by first launching an EC2 instance, and then we'll come back to some of the actual code we'll be running first. So I am already logged into the AWS Management Console, but if you go to AWS Management Console or just search it, the link will come up. If you don't already have an account, I'm afraid you won't be able to follow along fully because it can take some time to be approved. But if you do have an account, fantastic, and we will go ahead and run through this together. So your landing page may look a little bit different, no worries. If you get lost, just click the services dropdown and search EC2. So a brief overview of AWS. AWS is Amazon Web Services. It was started about 14 years ago, just with a few basic services, mostly launching virtual servers called Ec2 instances. They're elastic cloud compute, and they're basically little computers and machines running in the cloud. So you could have them set up to be web servers. You could have them set up, just as like file management or file processing. In this case, we're actually going to be setting them up both as a web server and as a Docker container running a graph database software called Neo4j. And the reason we're doing that is so that when we scrape our data from Reddit, we can actually populate this Docker container and visualize this data in the cloud. So to get started, and Lillian, if you can just let me know if there's any questions in the chat, because I'll be kind of running through this. We're going to select EC2. So it's the first compute service. All right. Now you should have something similar to this with the EC2 dashboard. It may kind of have some general text if it's your first time welcoming you, but what we really need is to launch an instance. And an instance is just another word for a virtual server. So in this case, we're going to just launch a regular one, and it's going to give us a couple of options here. So the first option is actually the AMI, and an AMI is an Amazon machine image. It's basically what kind of operating system you want to run. So in this case, the default is Linux 2, which is what we're going to use, but they have Red Hat. They have a couple different Windows options. They have Ubuntu. They have some for deep learning and lots of others. And I believe some you can search kind of through the community. But we're going to keep the default. So it should be just the 64-bit x86. And it's going to give us a couple of options here. So in this case, it's going to ask us which size of instance do we need? And the bigger the instance, the more powerful the computer. For our purposes, it's just a really basic web server that's going to run a Docker container. So it's going to be pretty small. And luckily, that means it'll be free tier eligible. So it's free for us to run. But just to show, there are a ton of options. So if you are an industry or a company like Netflix, for example, all of their servers that stream their content run on different AWS services, including EC2. So obviously they will need a much more powerful computer than we will need for our purposes. So again, we will stick with the default, and then we will go to configure instance details. So AWS is fantastic and gives you a whole lot of different options to choose from when it comes to the number you need, different networks. So if you want it to be public versus private, if you want to automatically give it an IP, which we absolutely need to do since it's going to be internet connected, roles, domains, whole lot of choices, most of which we don't really need to worry about. And even if you really get familiar with the AWS ecosystem, there are over 200 plus services with storage, blockchain, security, deep learning, microservices that run, just as Python code. So many different options to choose from. And I'm technically a certified solutions architect, but even I've only touched maybe 5 or 10% of all of them. In this case, what we really need to worry about is this user data. And user data can be configured as bash commands. So if anyone's familiar with the command line and bash scripts, it's just a set of instructions to give to the computer when it starts up. And luckily, we already have those commands written. So again, if that folder that needs to be downloaded, there's a file called docker bash. So we can actually take a look at that file. And we can see that there are some commands here. One is to run updates. So we're saying, yes, I want to do that. One is to install Docker, and Docker is a containerization service. It allows you to run applications with much less power than you would need otherwise. So you don't really have to worry too much about the operating system. And it's basically the bare bones functionality of an application that you're designing. So Docker is becoming very popular if you're designing apps and you don't want to have to worry about which operating system it's running on, any dependencies, or, oh, it's got one version of Python on this computer and another version on another computer. Docker allows you to kind of separate all of that. So that's super useful for us because downloading something like Neo4j would be multiple gigabytes. And we don't have that kind of storage space, but with Docker, we can use just the bare bones functionality. We're going to start the Docker service. This check config will basically tell our Ec2 instance that if our instance restarts or reboots, turn it back on. This command allows us to not have to type sudo each time. So if you're, again, familiar with a Linux environment, sudo stands for super user do, and it gives you essentially root privileges. So rather than type sudo docker every time we want to do something, we can just type docker. And then we're going to install Python 3. So we're going to copy this, and we're going to go back to our user data and just paste it in. And so when our instance launches, it will execute each of those commands. So then now we will go to add storage. In this case, the 8 GB root volume is more than sufficient. And we can add some tags. And tags are just metadata that you can associate with instances to make your life a little easier. So we can give it a name. I'm going to call mine Technica Neo4j. Great.
Question.
Sure.
Someone asked, what should you do if you already had a free trial of AWS? Create a new account?
So luckily, everything we're doing still should be in free tier. So don't worry if the trial expires. If somehow you were to be charged, I think max you'd pay like 3 or 4 cents because we're going to be running this server for a very, very short amount of time. And it's an incredibly cheap server to have. So I would say go ahead and still launch the instance. You shouldn't be charged anything though. And we'll show you how to turn it off at the end. Any other questions in the chat, Lillian?
I think we're okay.
Fantastic. Okay. So now we're going to set up our security groups. And security groups just allow us to set rules around which ports and which IPs can connect to our instance. So for example, SSH traffic allows us to directly connect to our instance and make some changes. So maybe we want to install a language other than Python, or we want to run an update. SSH allows us to do that. So there's a couple different security groups or rules that we need to set up. In this case, let's just go ahead and create a new one. I'm going to call this Technica Neo4j, and we don't really need to worry too much about the description. In this case, your SSH rule should be the default. It's saying, hey, you can connect over port 22 and anyone can connect. Some better security would be to say only my IP address can connect, but we'll set it as custom for now. So the next rule we need is to allow web traffic, and web traffic will be over HTTP. And notice it'll say port 80. And in this case, we definitely want anyone to be able to connect because it's publicly accessible to the internet. Now, with Neo4j, there are a couple different configurations that we need to set up around ports. So here is where the documentation is really helpful, because I hate saying I know how to do this just because it says so. I want to show where to actually find that information. And if you search Neo4j Docker, this is the link you'll get. And it's saying, hey, we've got this great integration between the two services. And how to do it is under this configuration. It's saying, hey, we need 3 ports. We need 7474 for HTTP, 7473 for HTTPS, and 7687 for Bolt. If any of you have ever worked in web development, you know that HTTPS has certificates associated, and that's just a way of validating security. That's a little bit more complex than we have time for. So we're going to focus just on 7474 and 7687. And this Bolt connection is basically just a direct line of access between the Docker container and the actual Neo4j application running inside of it. So we need those ports open as well. In this case, we're going to go and add those in. So we're going to say it's a custom TCP rule, and TCP is just a specific type of traffic. So we need 7687, and we're going to say anywhere. And let's add one more rule for that Bolt or for that other web traffic. So we can reference back and see it's 7474. 7474. And we can say anywhere. Now I'm going to just quickly reference the instructions to make sure I haven't missed anything. So we're going to launch a default, paste in the user data, and open up these ports. Fantastic. So now we can go and review and launch. And AWS will give you a warning and say, hey, you've got some ports open to the whole world. Not the best security practice, but we can keep it as is for now. Let's review and launch.
And we have
Again,
2 more questions. Sorry to
sure.
interrupt.
No worries.
One person said, what code did you put in for the user data?
Yes. So the user data code is copy and pasted from the Docker bash file, which should be included in the drive folder.
Okay. I think that knocked out the second question too, so I'll just resend that link again.
Thank you, much appreciated. All right, let's keep moving here then. So let's go ahead and launch. And it's going to ask us for a key pair. And a key pair is basically just a file system to ensure that when we're accessing our instance, we are the people who are supposed to be accessing it. And again, because this is just a workshop, not a huge deal of security, but you can imagine if this is maybe running some sort of private data, if it's processing credit cards, for example, you don't want anybody just connecting in. So we can create a new key pair. We can give it a name. Let's call it Technica Neo4j. And we definitely need to download. And you'll notice we can't even launch it until we actually download the file. And so it's going to download this .pem file to our computer. Now we can go ahead and launch. So that's going to take a few minutes, but we can kind of go through the rest of these instructions in the meantime. So let's turn towards the code side of this exercise. So I've created a notebook called Technica 2020 Scraper, and in that provides the instructions for how to actually connect to the Reddit API, scrape some data, and then convert it into JSON, which we will then put into our instance and visualize. So I'm going to kind of go through this cell by cell. I would have us kind of code it from scratch, but because we're limited to an hour and syntax can be a little bit strange, I've just kind of left it as is. So first things first, the Reddit API uses a library called pra. Don't know why, but it has some pretty helpful documentation. And it's basically saying, hey, it's a Python Reddit wrapper. It needs at least Python 3.6. You can use these client IDs and secrets to actually connect. And it's got just some really fantastic documentation around how to connect to the Reddit API and scrape data. So I didn't, build this code just kind of willy-nilly. Learning how to search for and read documentation and use code examples is a really great skill to have. So always encourage checking out the documentation, especially if you're using a language like Python, where it's readily available. So first, we're going to pip install pra because it's not by default installed with Colab. And Colab, for those of you who are new to it, is essentially just Google's virtual Jupyter Notebook environment. It allows us to run Python code in a kind of stable environment. We don't have to worry about file paths or installations. It's just a very convenient way of coding. So we're going to start by running this cell. And it'll take a few seconds to connect to Google, but once it's connected, it'll go pretty quickly. So it's just getting the library and it's installing it. Second is now we need to actually import the library, and we're going to also use pandas, which is great for data frames, JSON, which is used for JavaScript object notation data, the datetime library, so we can do some date conversions, and sys. So sys is SYS, it's the system library. We're not actually going to use it here too much, but if we were running this on our own computer or when we put this in our instance, that's where sys becomes helpful because it allows us to get arguments from the command line. So this part you should be able to create with your Reddit dev account. So if you followed that document, you'd basically create a Reddit account, get to this page, and you would create an application. I called it UMD Bits for the Business and IT Society. It's a club I run, which will have information about your client and client secret. And just for security purposes, I'm going to turn off my screen sharing for a quick second, run this cell, and then go down because it has my personal Reddit username and password, which I'd prefer not to share with 113 participants. So if you can, try and copy and paste from that step in the file, and then we'll keep going from there. So let me just turn off my screen sharing for a very brief second and copy and paste that code in. Lillian, how are we doing in the chat?
We have 2 questions.
Okay.
Someone asked if you're creating a scraper that you want to use for a while, but which won't be handling sensitive data, would you still make it more secure?
So it depends. Depends on who you're scraping it for. I would say if it's for a company, maybe it's some sort of work necessity. You know, security should always be top of mind. If it's just for like a personal use, if you're scraping, you know, Reddit or maybe you're messing around with like the Bloomberg terminal or something, then security might not be top of mind. In general, 2 best practices are always give the least privilege necessary. So we had our SSH port open to the whole world, which meant anybody who got a hold of those PEM files could connect to our instance. That's bad practice. And don't leave API credentials in your code, which is another bad practice that we're actually going to do as well. But if you're posting, you know, for example, this code to your GitHub, make sure you remove your client ID, your username, and your password before you post it, because anybody could then look at that code and copy and paste it and use it for their own purposes.
Okay, the second question was, could you use a Linux terminal environment to run commands like pip install? How would running install commands differ with different OSs for scrapers?
Oh, that is always the question, right? How does something work on one computer versus another? The operating system, when you're using something like pip install, shouldn't be too much of a problem. It's more about the version of Python and where you're using it. So if you're just using straight Python, pip install usually works fine from the command line on Windows or Linux. If you're using Conda or like Anaconda, it can get maybe a little bit more complex. Sometimes you have to use the Conda terminal. But in general, pip install works roughly the same across different operating systems. And if it doesn't work, it's always just a Google search away and Stack Overflow. All right, I'm going to share out my screen again, and we're going to keep moving. So I've gone ahead and run those 2 cells, and I ran this quick Reddit cell just to make sure that I've successfully connected. So what we've created is what's called a client, and a client is basically just an object that gives us a connection to an API. So first things first, we've got this sys.argv. In true code, or I guess if we were running this on the command line, or when we do, sys.argv would actually be an already existing variable because it would represent the code we've written on the command line. But since we don't have a command line, since we're using Colab, we're just going to create a variable called sys.argv. In this case, we're going to prompt the user to enter a command. The command that we will be using is Python, or in reality, Python 3, since we'll be running this on our instance. That's to tell us we need to use Python, the name of the file, which will be reddit api.py, and the subreddits we want to scrape. In this case, we're going to scrape UMD, UMDCS, and terps. And our last argument needs to be the number of messages that we're going to scrape. In this case, I'd like to get the top 100 posts from each. So let's enter it in. In this case, we're going to print out the arguments and the type, and we can see that it's read in as a list because of that split command. And split will basically give you a list split by spaces, so or whatever character I've put here, which is just an empty space. Now, when we run from the command line, the Python argument wouldn't actually get included, so we should remove it to make this code as realistic as possible. So in this case, I'm going to say from position 1, since lists are 0-based, to the length. So I'm saying start from here and then go to the rest of the length. I don't want this Python 3 argument. Let's run that. And we can see it's been eliminated. Next, we're going to actually count the system arguments, which are the subreddit names, and subtract 1, since the script name will always be included. So essentially what we're asking here is, how many subreddits do we need to process? In this case, we are processing 3 plus the number itself, so 4. Now we need to check if the arguments equal 0. So if we just typed in Python 3 and didn't feed in any other names, we would basically get an error that we didn't provide any arguments. So we're just going to run this check. In this case, it's not going to do anything because we entered our command in properly. And we want the last system argument to be the number of posts retrieved. So in this case, rather than saying go from 1 to the length, we want the length minus 1 is the position of the last argument. So we can assign that. And we will basically run a try except to convert that to an integer. So we want the position, which will be, I believe, position 4, and convert whatever is at position 4 to an integer. So if we count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 100 is at position 4, and that should be an integer. And we can print that just to confirm. And if that doesn't work, we should give them a system exit message saying a mistake was made, and here is how you would actually run the command. Lillian, I'm going to pause here just for a second to take any questions from the chat.
There doesn't seem to be any questions right now pertaining to this right now, but if anyone has any, feel free to drop any in chat or feel free to unmute yourself.
All right, so silence is golden. Okay, so now we are ready to actually begin scraping data from the API. In this case, we can test our scraper by manually providing an argument before we convert the code into a loop. So essentially what we're doing in this collab is showing how the code works cell by cell. And then in the folder that it was downloaded has the actual complete code ready to go. So we're going to kind of take this one at a time. Let's just take the first position. So that's at position 1 because lists are 0-based. We're going to run another try except, and see if we can get the actual subreddit. So we want the name, which will be, in this case, UMD, since that was the first argument. And we're going to pass it into our Reddit object, and let's see if it works. And if it does, we want to get a list-like object with the top, or you could sub out for newest, which to get the subreddit, or use subreddit.new to get the newest posts. And we have a limit of 1,000. In this case, we only need 100, so it's not too much of a problem. And then again, if there's something that goes wrong, or if our user inputs commands incorrectly, throw an error. So nothing happened, so that's good. Now let's actually take a look at how the data is passed. And it's passed as this listing generator object. So when you're scraping from APIs like Reddit, to be efficient in the way that they pass data, they passed it in these listing generator objects, and it allows you to kind of parse through one by one rather than have the data just shoved to you all at once. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to parse through one at a time. We can use a library called pprint, which allows you to kind of go through listing generator objects a little bit easier and see the variables associated with it. So we've got our submission. We want to see just the first one. We don't want to see all 100 at once. And we just kind of want to see some of the data associated. Let's take a look. And if we notice, it's got sort of this nested key value pair structure. And there's a lot of different attributes actually stored in Reddit that we can examine. So let me go ahead and move some of these tabs around. And let's see what's going on. So it's saying it's using this Reddit object, and it's got a whole lot of information, something about the icon URL, the name, which might be the title of the post. We've got some icons. We've got information around the author's flair, if you're familiar with Reddit at all. The created time, that's pretty helpful for us to know when this post was made. And a couple different attributes that might be useful as well. So the name could be the name of the author, and then some information around some of the other images associated too. And we don't need all of these attributes. So we're just going to choose a couple that we actually care about. Let's start with the author, the title, the score. So that's the karma, right? How many people have liked or kind of commented on the post, the ID, the URL, number of comments created, etc. And we're going to just create this as a dictionary object. And we can see that we've just created this empty dictionary. Now we want to loop through this generator and actually get the data we need. And so because it's a generator, anytime you loop through it, it expires. So we have to recreate it. And that's where we're going to run this same code again to actually get the subreddit we want. And we can see again that we've created a list generator. Now we're going to iterate through each of those submissions. So there should be 100 in there because it's the top subreddit. And we asked for 100. And we're going to append those values to our dictionary. So we can do that. And it'll run for a bit. And it didn't return anything because it seems to be working just fine. Let's actually take a look at what that dictionary looks like. Okay, so we've got some author names. And then we can kind of go around and looks like maybe some titles. We've got some links. But for the most part, it looks like our data is being read in correctly. This isn't super easy to read though. So let's take a look at it as a data frame. Luckily with the pandas library, we can easily convert a dictionary, which is a bunch of key value pairs, to a data frame, which is more similar to a table. And using the head command, we can see the first 5 results. So let's take a look. We can see that we have Kinky Unicorn. We've got the title of the post, the score, the ID, the URL, the comments, the time created in UTC format, the body, so if there was any actual text and not an image, the number of subscribers to the subreddit, and the subreddit itself. So it looks like our data is being read in correctly. Next, we can actually convert this date time format to ISO, which is an international standard, because this format is not helpful at all. If any of you are able to calculate what this time is, since I think it's like some day in 1970 by your head, I would be incredibly impressed. Luckily, we have a library to do it for us. So we're going to say, hey, we've got this created column. I want to convert it to this UTC format, and I want to apply it to that column. And then I want to rename it to timestamp, and in place just means don't create a new column. And let's see if that works. And it did. We can see we've went from that really ugly UTC format to seeing, okay, this was posted on July 24th in 2020. And the column is now named timestamp. Okay, let's keep moving. We're almost done, and then we can get to the fun part of actually running this in our Ec2 instance. Okay, we need to convert it to JSON, but running conversions between a data frame, so this tabular format, and JSON, which is sort of this key value pair structure we'll take a look at, is very slow. So what we need to do is actually convert it back to a dictionary. And luckily we have this toDict function, and it's going to convert it back. So it's going to convert it back using this records argument. And records just means kind of store it where you have your author to your URL rather than all of your authors, all of your body, all of your comment numbers, etc. And we can see we have 100 individual little splices of data. So pretty helpful. Now, last but not least, we want to actually export this data to our desktop. So we can do that using this from Google Colab import files. We're going to open a file and we're going to say whatever the current subreddit is that we're processing. So if it's UMD, the file will be named umd_subreddit.json, umd_cs, etc. And we're going to download it. So now we can run that. And we can see it's downloaded to the desktop. Now, before we move on, I want to actually take a look at what JSON is, because JSON is how a lot of web data is formatted, and it's called JavaScript Object Notation. So it's very, very common and good to just know what it is. So we can open this file. We can do Control-A and Control-C to copy it, and then we can paste it in. So, okay, not super intelligible at all. So let's click Viewer. And we can see we've got 100 of these records, so 0 to 99. And we can see it's the exact same data that we processed. So JSON Viewer is a very helpful website if you have JSON data that you're not able to kind of tell what it is just by looking at this. You can throw it into this website and it'll process or parse it out and make it much more user-friendly. And we can see we have all of our data processed successfully. Okay, so let's look at the next steps. We've gone through the Reddit API code. Now we need to actually use the personal Reddit API file to copy in our client ID. And then we're actually going to start passing in some files to our Ec2 instance. So I'm going to pause my sharing again just to get my credentials into the Reddit API.py file. That file is in the folder as well. And also, the completed code with the looping is right here. So if you notice, the only code we actually added was looping to the next argument. So going through each subreddit and this little while loop, basically saying, while we still have some arguments to go through, print them out and run the exact same code. Okay, let me pause sharing for a quick second. And let me go ahead and get my Reddit API file ready to be processed. So the Reddit API file should also be with the import Reddit messages file, the Docker bash file, and a couple others, all in the Reddit folder. So just confirm that those files are there, and you need to replace the client ID, client secret, user agent, username, and password with your own Reddit credentials. And if you have done that successfully, then we'll be ready to move on. Okay, looks like I have my Reddit code ready to go. So I'm going to close out of that. And we're going to learn how to actually move files into our instance. So I'm going to go ahead and share back out and pause just for a quick second for any questions. How are we doing on that front, Lillian?
We have one. Someone said, I noticed that JSON seems to be the default way to export data. Why use JSON? Are there any other Python alternatives?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a fantastic question. It really depends on the API, the way you're scraping. So in this case, we're pulling data from an API. Some people might use a library to scrape data with requests, where you don't use an API and you just go to the website and inspect the HTML and say, I want this div or I want this address link. It's just a matter of structuring. So sometimes it's JSON, sometimes it's XML, but most times you're interacting with web data, it's going to be JSON. And the reason is that JavaScript part is how a lot of websites run. It's what allows websites to be dynamic. So the data that comes from it is JavaScript object notation. Any other questions before we keep going?
I think that might be it.
Fantastic. We actually are ahead of schedule, so this is great. Okay, here's where it might get a little bit messy. To connect files, no, we don't need to do that right now. To actually connect to your instance, the easiest way is to use something like Winscp, and SCP stands for Secure Copy, or to use Filezilla if you're on a Mac. I'm going to demonstrate the Winscp method first, and then quickly run through the Filezilla instructions that are on the document. I don't have Filezilla installed, but I'll show you the instructions for how to do it. Or if somebody would like to, I'm happy to walk you through it quickly if you're on a Mac, and you can share out your screen for the benefit of the other participants. Let's go through the Winscp method first. So once you open it up, it's going to give you a prompt for new site. And site just means a connection to a different computer. We can keep this file protocol as a default. So SFTP is secure file transport protocol. And it's going to ask for a host. And a host is, which computer are you connecting to? Here's where we actually are going to go back to AWS and get some of that information. So we can click this, or if you are on a different page, go to the services dropdown and select EC2. And we can see we have one running instance. Fantastic. So we can get what's called the Ipv4 Dns. And DNS is domain name system. It's how the internet essentially is routed. It's connecting addresses to computers. So we can copy this Ipv4 DNS, and that's going to be the host. It's going to tell our computer where to connect. So this is not the easiest way to copy it. You can bring up this smaller window here, and if you click these two squares, that'll actually copy it to your clipboard, or you can just highlight it. So let's do that. If we go to Winscp, we can paste that in. It's going to connect over 22, which is SSH, and we need to give it a username. And the default username for a lot of AWS images is ec2-user. Now, if we tried to log in right now, it would basically say, hey, I'm trying to connect over SSH. Can I do it? And it's going to fail because we didn't actually give it the proper keys. So we can say, okay, and we can try again. So we can paste in our DNS. We can try ec2-user. And now we're actually going to give it the correct files to connect. So we can click advanced, and it should pull up a separate window. Now we can click SSH, and we can go to authentication. And this is how we connect to our instance. Agent forwarding is helpful. That allows you to kind of pass the key between your computer and the instance. I'm not sure if it's absolutely essential, but I always check it. And it's going to ask us for the private key. So your instance has a public key, and think of that as like a lock. You have the key and your instance has the lock, but you might have multiple keys, so you need to tell it which one. So we can click this triple dot here, and we can go to our downloads, which is where my PEM file is. And it's not going to show up because the default is PPK, which is a private key file. We actually need to change the conversion. So we should select all private keys to get the PEM. And now this Technica Neo4j file pops up. So I can hit open. It's going to ask me to convert. I'm going to say okay. It's going to save it to the exact same directory. And it's going to give me the success message. And I'm going to hit okay. And now if I log in, we can see I'm actually connected into my instance, and I'm in the home EC2 user directory. So what I want to do is actually copy the contents of my Reddit folder over here. And it's just a very quick, click and drag. And now it's there. And we can click in and we can see we've got this post folder, we've got the scraper, I've got the Reddit API file, everything else that I need to actually get going. So easiest way to get out is just to X out. It's going to say terminate without saving. That's fine because the files are already on there. Now, if you are on a Mac or you're just choosing to use Filezilla, here's how we would do it. So we're going to click this. It's PDF, so it's fine. We're going to skip all of this because we don't need that. And we're going to go to Filezilla. Your interface should look something like this. Then you're going to click settings, which is probably in that file edit view in the top left-hand corner if you're on a Mac. Click SFTP. You're going to add your key file. Then you're going to find the PEM, which should be in your downloads directory. It may prompt you for this. Some users, it does not. You're going to give it the PPK extension. It's going to add it. You're going to go to settings, which may look like a triple kind of computer view or a triple like server icon. I think they've updated the icon in the top left. You're going to create a new site. You're going to put in the DNS address like we did with SCP. You're going to keep it as, or you're going to change the protocol to SFTP. Instead of Ubuntu, you're going to type in ec2-user. You can type in password as password all lowercase. It might give you a prompt, it might not. Just hit OK. And then you should be logged in and you should be able to drag and drop. So very similar process. Is anyone on a Mac or using Filezilla that would mind if I demonstrated along them or alongside with them how to do it? Lillian, do we have any takers by chance?
Not that I see yet.
Okay, that's all right. The doc or the link is in the PDF. So let's actually get this up and running in our EC2 instance. So next steps, we actually need to connect to our instance. So that's a pretty easy process. Hopefully you can use Instance Connect. If not, we'll do it through the terminal. So again, we can go back to instances. I'm going to minimize this. I've got my Technica server running, and I can go to Actions, Connect. So EC2 Instance Connect is an awesome option because it basically opens up a shell right in your browser. So a shell is basically just a way of talking to your computer in the cloud, and it's much easier to do it if you're already in your browser. So we can hit Connect. On my computer, for particular reasons, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So right now it's working. I'm going to show you how to connect if it doesn't pull up here. So I can hit log out, or I can just close this. If it doesn't pop you, or if it doesn't work on your browser, you can actually do this from the command line. So you can run this command. So whoops, let's go ahead and copy this. And you can open up any type of terminal if you're on a Mac, or Git Bash if you're on Windows. And you need to change directory to where your PEM file is. In this case, mine is on the downloads directory. Hit enter and run the command. It's going to ask if I want to continue connecting. I'm going to type in yes. And notice again, I have the exact same prompt. And I can do a quick ls to list the contents, and I can see I have my Reddit folder. Fantastic. So if you're at this screen, either in EC2 Instance Connect or in your own personal terminal, fantastic. Lillian, I see there's a little chat activity. I'll pause here for a quick second.
It's not really related to this exactly. There's someone in the chat having trouble with opening up the Python file with Colab. So I'm not sure if we need to go over this right now.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't quite know the schedule of workshops, but I'm happy to stay after for a few minutes to help troubleshoot if need be. So we'll keep moving for now, and then double back for anyone having some technical troubles. Okay. So we are connected to our instance. We've got the Reddit file in there, and the API code is already set up. It's the exact same code that we just ran through in the Colab notebook. So now we need to actually run the code in our instance so that the JSON is stored in our server or in our computer here instead of our computer desktop. So let's go back to the instructions here, and we need to run some commands. So first things first, we have Docker installed, but we don't actually have the Neo4j image. And an image is essentially just which type of application are you running. And images come from the Docker Hub. So let's take a quick look at that, and we should be able to finish right on time. So the Docker Hub is a way to host your own containers or look at the contents of others. So we can search for content. So let's see Neo4j. And we can see that they actually have one. It's got 10 million plus downloads. So it's their image on the hub. There are tons for Python, MySQL, PHP, Apache, almost anything that you can think of to run. There is usually already a Docker image created for that. So all you need to do is pull the image and then make any additional changes to actually run that application rather than having to go manually download the Neo4j executable file, which might be a much, much larger file. Let's take a quick look. We can see it's an official image, and we can see the command, just docker pull neo4j. Fantastic. It's going to give us some documentation about the different versions, some other useful tools. What neo4j is, it's a graph database. How to use it, we're going to run a very similar command. Again, it's talking about those 2 ports that we need, volumes that will be bounded, and a few other pieces of information. So let's start with the docker pull command. So we can type docker pull neo4j, and it's going to go ahead and download that file. And we're installing an entire graph database application in a matter of seconds, rather than, however long your internet speed would actually take to download this file and install it. So it's very lightweight, and that's what makes Docker so popular. And it's going to give us the success message. Next steps are to actually run it. So the basic syntax of a Docker command is docker run. You want to give your container a name. I'm going to call it test neo4j. And I'm going to run it in detached mode. So if I did not include this option, it would automatically give me a shell, so another connection into that container. I don't really care too much about what's happening in the container. I just want to launch it. I'm going to say, I need you to connect 7474 to the outside world to 7474 to the container. Do the same thing with 7687. With this -v command, I'm going to bind some volumes. And binding just means I'm able to store data from my Docker container to my host computer. So if I'm processing something like a graph database, I want to be able to store that data on my host computer in case I need to terminate the container. It's just a way of backing up. So I'm going to store the general data volume, the logs, and the import, as well, in addition to the plugins. And then I'm going to set an environment variable for the neo4j authentication. Basically, what's going to be my username and password? It's going to be neo4j as the username and password as the password. And then finally, which image? Going to run neo4j. Great. So let's go ahead and copy this in. Let's paste it. And notice if you copy and paste, sometimes it can get a little messy. So one thing that's helpful is putting it into a notepad file, or I believe it's a text editor on a Mac. So we can just create a new file, paste this command in. Let's get rid of the spaces here. So let's just delete that, copy it again, and then paste that command instead. So let's get rid of all this. And now you can see it pastes as one line instead. And it's actually returning this, which is the name of the container, basically saying it's working. To check, we can type docker ps, and we can see we have a container running called test neo4j, and it's the neo4j image. Fantastic. So now we're going to quickly run our Python commands, and then we're going to visualize that data. So now we are going to change directory into our Reddit folder. So right now we can see that we are in ec2-user, change directory to Reddit, list the contents. We can see that we've got all of our files. Great. Now we're going to actually install the requirements. So requirements are just all the different libraries we need to actually get this to work. So we're going to use that with pip3, and because it's Python 3 that we installed, we need the pip3 command. It's going to install stuff like pandas, the neo4j libraries, pra, all the different libraries that we use to scrape data, process it, and actually get it into our graph database. So once that command has been run, we will then actually run our Python code. In this case, we have some templates. So it's just saying, hey, how many subreddits do you want, and the number of messages. I'm going to run it for the UMD, UMDCS, and terps subreddits. So I'm going to copy that command and run it. And it will basically list my arguments and say that it's exporting to JSON. Great, that's what I want. So now we will actually import those into our graph database. And I know I didn't cover the import Reddit messages py file. It's relatively basic, and the cipher code, which is essentially the SQL, so to speak, of graph databases, it's a way of converting JSON or CSV data to nodes and edges in a graph database. That code is also included in the folder. So we're going to quickly run that. And it should just give us a confirmation that it's successfully uploaded. Great. It says all data has been uploaded and is ready for viewing. Fantastic. So here's the actually interesting part. Let's see what it looks like. And notice we needed that 7474 for internet connectivity. So if we copy the public DNS of our instance and specify that we want to see port 7474, we actually get Neo4j, which confirms that our Docker container is working. So we can go back to EC2. We can take a look at our instances. And we can again copy that public DNS address. So we can copy it, put it in our browser and say 7474. And it will actually load Neo4j. It'll prompt us for a username and password, which we set. And now we are going to be connected. So very briefly, let's see what our data looks like. This command says match all nodes with all relationships to all other nodes, and I want to return everything. I want to see all of my data. Let's see what that looks like. Sometimes it takes a little bit to run, especially noting that this is not a very powerful instance, but it will return our data. And we can see now that we've successfully taken our JSON data and actually converted it to nodes and edges. So we've got this message that was posted in the subreddit chirps. It was posted by a none author, which means that the post was deleted. And we can see how it's connected to all of these other nodes. But the Neo4j browser is not the best for visualization. So we're going to take a look at one last tool that's really, really powerful. And it's called GraphXR. GraphXR is essentially the Neo4j browser, but good. It's designed to handle thousands of nodes at the same time. It's very colorful. It's in 3 dimensions. And it's very just interesting and fun to look at. So if you have an account, you can log in. You can create what's called a project. I'm going to call this Technica Neo4j 2020. And you can set up an instance. And again, it's going to ask for that host. That's going to be your DNS, which is the instance that you want to actually connect to. It's automatically specifying 7687. It knows the username should be Neo4j, but we need to give it a password, which is password. And instead of doing browser connect, we're going to go through the GraphXR server. We're going to hit confirm, and it's going to give us the project. We can actually connect to it, and then we're going to run that exact same command, and we're going to take a look at how that data is visualized. All right, so it's giving us a blank area, and we can hit here on the left-hand side to query for data. So we can go back to that match command. Whoops. And let's see what the data actually looks like. And GraphXR is a lot faster. And we can actually zoom out and see that we have multiple clusters of data. And I believe I already put in some default JSON just in case the Reddit API crashed. But we can actually take a look at all of these different nodes. We can see that this was posted in the UMD subreddit. We can see the author, the title of the post, and associated information for lots and lots of different subreddits. In this case, this was the TERP subreddit. We can see how many subscribers it has. And let's actually check that this information is real. Maybe it's, just a mistake. So let's start with this post here. So we've got what looks like maybe the setup to a programming joke, and we can take a look at this post ID. So if I copy this, put it in my browser, and I say umdcs Reddit, and then give it the post ID, let's see if it's the same post that was actually scraped. So let's try a different one that might be a little bit more popular, or we can try and search it directly in Reddit. That's one alternative. And let's just quickly type that in and see if we got posts. We'll try one other that might be a little bit more popular. Take a look at some of the overlap there. Let's try, actually, one easy thing we can do. I believe this should be the UMD subreddit. Great. Let's take a look at any one of these posts. Okay, this one's talking about somebody whose wife surprised at Testudo. So let's see, dbar61, UMD Reddit. And hey, we've got the post. And so we can see that this was actually on, or one of the top 100 posts in the UMD subreddit. So let's take a quick second to recap what we've done so far. We've created a Reddit API, or we've created a connection to the Reddit API. We've specified which subreddits we want to scrape data from and how many posts. We've launched an Ec2 instance, installed Docker to run the Neo4j graph database as a container, and then we've connected that instance to GraphXR to better visualize the information that we have scraped. So this actually concludes the workshop. I know we're only about 2 minutes remaining, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments now.
We have a few questions. Someone said, could you run this from a local server and a VM instead of an AWS server?
Yes, absolutely. The way we've created this architecture with Docker might need to be changed a little, but you can actually install Docker for your desktop. It's a really friendly UI. And then you would basically open up a terminal with Docker and do the exact same thing where we've installed the Docker image. We ran a Neo4j container and connected it to our computer and put in some files. So yes, you can absolutely run it locally.
Another one is, where should we look, or what should be looked into for creating our own visualizations for the scraper data?
So depends if you're looking to do it as a graph database. So you have nodes, which can be posts, authors, and channels, and edges, which are the relationships. Neo4j and GraphXR are a great combination. If you want to do something more two-dimensional, like Tableau could be a great way of actually kind of visualizing the number of posts over time. You could use a Python library like NLTK, which is the natural language toolkit, and you could run sentiment analysis to see if the post itself was positive or negative or objective or subjective. So it really depends on the use case. Are you doing it for yourself, for a client, for a school assignment? Lots and lots of different options.
Great. And one last one for now. How would you stop the EC2?
Yes, glad you asked. So all you have to do is go back to the instance dashboard. You can get out of this. You can go to actions and then instance. Whoops, let me select the actual instance. Yep. Actions, manage instance state, and you can hit terminate. It might look a little bit different depending on your UI, but essentially you'd go to the instance state and you'd say you want to terminate that instance. And that will basically delete all the files, stop the instance from running, and you won't be charged for anything. So I'm actually just going to keep mine running for the time being because I'm going to use this for a different activity later, but that is how you would turn it off.
There's another question. What are examples of scrapers used for industry purposes?
This one, actually. So my company that I'll be working for full-time, Accenture Federal Services, when I was an intern, we needed to scrape data from the blockchain and from different social media outlets to be able to track cryptocurrency pump and dump organizers. So we scraped data and we said, these are the kind of criteria we're looking for. Maybe it's an IP address, maybe it's a Bitcoin wallet, and we put it all together in GraphXR and gave it to the client so that they could actually find people who were organizing illegal activity. But there are thousands of applications of APIs, whether it be looking at trading data, whether it's scraping from Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else. There's a lot of uses for them.
And we are nearing a little bit over time, but we'll take maybe one more question. And then for those of you who actually have more questions, we can actually make a new channel in Slack if you want. This last question is from Jasper. Can you also give a quip about how we would remove API code?
Sure. So the API code itself, if you're talking about the client ID, you would just essentially delete that from the code itself, and maybe you would pass it in as an environment variable, for example. The way this scraper is set up, it's a little bit tougher to do. But if you're concerned about posting this to your GitHub, just make sure you delete your client ID and essentially those personal credentials right at the beginning of the file. And then feel free to use it for other applications. But usually people pass in their API credentials as a variable or through a file that they upload that's encrypted.
Okay, great. For those of you who have questions still, we might make a Slack channel, or if you need any questions, just drop them into the questions channel. Thank you so much for presenting this workshop. A lot of them really appreciate it. It was really informational. And for all those of you hacking, have a great rest of your night. Happy hacking, and see you tomorrow. As always, this recording will be posted on the YouTube channel later. Sorry to cut you off.
No worries. I just wanted to say good luck to everyone. Technica, again, is a fantastic event. Really happy to be here. And good luck hacking. Have a great time. Lillian, just a quick question. I apologize if you need to drop. For questions, is that something that I need to be in a Slack channel for? Or I guess if they had questions around this, how would I respond? Or would they be for